I apologise in advance for this video. It's going to be a rambly and wild one, but hopefully that will help to add to the subject matter, which is quite simply why the Star Trek original timeline no longer exists, nor did it ever, except that it does. The Mirror Universe is a strange anomaly of Star Trek, well, one of many. Its exact origin is still not established in canon, but it seems to be pre-World Wars. We've seen that different choices in Star Trek end up spiralling out into entire new realities, as in Star Trek Parallels, and occasionally alterations to the timeline, such as the Kelvin Universe timeline films. However, alterations to the timeline can also produce overwrites to a current reality, such as TNG's Yesterday's Enterprise, Voyager's Year of Hell, or even its series finale. This creates a confusing situation of messy timelines, where Star Trek tends to go with whatever version of parallel universes and time travel that suits the narrative for that episode. This becomes apparent when you try to map out an entire cohesive timeline with all of these alterations in mind, and that is even before we take into account the temporal Cold War. Earth's attack at the hands of the Xindi in Enterprise was described by the Temporal Agency of the 31st century as something that should not have happened, and when it did, it endangered their future. So, there are two ways to look at such an alteration. The first is that this attack existed in the lore as part of everything post-2154, post-Enterprise series, and just not mentioned. Obviously, in reality, it's not mentioned because it was not a plot point back when TOS, TNG and so on were being scripted. We can still assume, though, that it is a part of these Star Trek's history. Suspension of disbelief just has to fill in the lack of mentions in those series as canon. Option 2 is that in those shows, the alteration did not exist until the Xindi were manipulated by future powers to attack. Now everything post-attack no longer exists, because it has been overwritten by the Enterprise Temporal War timeline. Or it was fractured off into its own timeline, but that latter one is not what we saw, as we also saw Daniels' future, the future of that Enterprise reality, being overwritten by alterations. So no parallel universes here, just a changed timeline. These sorts of vaguely defined time travel rules frequently change every time there is a similar incident, no matter how small. When Sisko travels back to 2024, he replaces Gabriel Bell in the riots to ensure that history unfolds as it should. But now Sisko, as Bell, is a new addition to that timeline. So everything chronologically after past tense, part 1, is now in a slightly varied reality. Trials and Tribulations is another example of DS9 overwriting a prior universe. Originally in Trouble with Tribbles, the individuals taking part in the bar fight were these lot. Now post DS9's interference, O'Brien and Bashir stand alongside Chekhov and Scotty in the disciplinary. The original timeline, as it were, is gone. With Yesterday's Enterprise, we have a major alteration to the timeline which has lasting ramifications, the most notable of which is Tasha Yar being alive and sent back in time to 2344, where she then ends up having Seela. So again, we have the question of, did Seela exist prior to Yesterday's Enterprise, or just pop into existence at the resolution of that episode? First Contact, the film, sees history being altered from 2063 onwards, with the Borg taking over humanity by assimilating it all. The Enterprise E fixes this, but considering we briefly saw the reality where they failed and assimilated Earth, I assume this means that the Borg were interfering with established events, and no matter how preferable the outcome, First Contact onwards now exists in an altered universe, one where Cochrane got drunk with Deanna Troi and his co-pilots were LaForge and Riker. In Time's Arrow, we have an event that begins with the discovery of Data's head, before he is sent back to 1893, thus creating a paradox. In this example, time has not been changed at all. because the events we witnessed happened in the original timeline, and returning to 2368 sees the completion of the loop. Little Green Men sees Quark and co. crash on Earth in 1947, and that becomes the basis for the Roswell incident, something that again already existed in Star Trek's continuity before the point of origin of the time travel incident. These examples are in opposition to the notion that time can be altered, suggesting that time only ever unfolds one way. TNG's Parallels shows that a person's free will effectively manipulates the creation of other universes. For every action not taken, a new timeline where it was spins into existence, meaning that there are infinite realities. But none of these are considered alterations to an existing timeline, merely multiverses, all coexisting out of phase with one another. So what we are left with is time travel that creates branches in history, except when it doesn't. Alternate timelines are made when there are changes, except when it's supposed to happen, and sometimes changes are so small that they're insignificant, except no, hang on, they really have overwritten the in-universe continuity. I haven't even got started on Discovery's inclusion into this spaghetti of timelines, but considering that their future was going to result in the AI control destroying everything, they changed time to avoid this outcome, resulting in another major, if preferable, alteration. So, just as with every alteration story we've had previously, we're left with two options. Either everything chronologically post-2257 Discovery in-universe is gone because it now exists in an altered timeline, or the Red Bursts incidents had occurred in all of these subsequent shows and it was just never mentioned, like the Xindi attack. Again, Discovery made it clear that they weren't dealing with an alternate reality where control destroys all life, but the same timeline, which is now forever defunct. This is why I find most arguments of what Trek did or didn't happen is kind of pointless, because Star Trek's decades of inconsistency in establishing and holding to firm laws of time travel have long since messed up the timeline. Now, I'm not saying this to rag on Star Trek, it's just that in the end, the only thing we have to go on is the creator's intent and what is said in the shows, despite how much a square shape is hammered into a circular hole. The logic that Enterprise cannot exist in the same universe as TNG, or that Discovery cannot exist before TOS, is theoretically sound, if you want to adopt the philosophy that every alteration, no matter how minor, has changed the Trek timeline further from its original. But this logic then has to be applied to every similar event in Trek's history, making untangling what even is the original timeline an impossible mess. My personal approach to this is just to accept it's all make-believe, which I know sounds strange coming from a lore channel that loves to get immersed in the nitty-gritty of things, but honestly it's the simplest solution to just shrug it off and say, sure, it's all one linearity. It doesn't all fit, because it does not have to obey any real-world laws. And its in-universe ones are often changing to suit whatever writer, studio or company wants at the time. I love Star Trek and its stories, books, shows, comics and games, and there are hundreds of tales to tell in the expanded Star Trek mythos. And to my mind, all of them are true in some universe or another anyway. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I said it would get rambly, but this is a topic I never really even considered until I started trying to make a consistent timeline for the Trek universe, a subject I revisit every once in a while to see if I can create a map. I've been Rick, and until the next one, thanks for watching and feel free to take part in a discussion below, because I'm going to be lurking in the comments to check them out. Thanks again, and goodbye.